Conversations across time. 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 Conversations across time.
This footage was shot around noon on Monday, as about 100 National Guardsmen broke up the scheduled rally in a part of campus known as the Commons. At around 12:25 p.m., hundreds of students are watching when the Guardsmen near the top of a rise called Blanket Hill. A handful of students throw stones. As the troops crest the hill, some of them turn back. First a few, then several more. There's a gunshot, perhaps two, followed immediately by a barrage.
There were people trying to hide behind a curb. If you could dig a hole that fast, you would have, when you realized you were being shot at.
Some of the Guardsmen shoot into the air, some towards the ground, but at least 8 fire at students. In just over 13 seconds, an estimated 60 rounds of live ammunition are discharged.
I could hear the bullets hitting the ground around me, and I'm thinking, why are they shooting at me? Oh my God, this is crazy. And it seemed like it went on forever, and then all of a sudden I got hit.
I could feel that my leg was numb, and I sat up to try to look down at my wound, and then I heard someone yelling, "Stay down, stay down."
I was struck with a bullet that hit me in the abdomen, and seems like it blew me through the air, and I landed on the ground.
It's like getting hit in the chest with a sledgehammer. I mean, just suddenly this thing just slammed into my chest. And then I dropped right near that metal sculpture. And that's pretty much the last I remember.
As the gun smoke clears, the Guardsmen turn and march back through the Commons. Left behind are the shell-shocked, the wounded, and the dead. Jeffrey Mueller, Allison Krauss, Sandra Scheuer, and William Schroeder. Schroeder and Scheuer were not part of the protest. They were simply on their way to class.
Good evening. Welcome once again to Conversations Across Time. You'll note that last week we were talking about a topic that seems to be very significant for what's going on today. And that's what we do here at Conversations Across Time. We talk about historical events and how they apply to today. With me tonight, once more, is the Conversations Across Time show historian, Mark Hoffman. Welcome, Mark.
Great to be back.
And this is the second part of what we are calling the Kent State Massacre and the Vietnam War, compared to Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller and the Trump presidency. So we are actually comparing Kent State and the war in Vietnam to the Mueller investigation and the Trump presidency.
Yeah, and the thing is, with that, don't forget, the whole thing with Watergate and the cover-up was about Vietnam, who leaked the Pentagon Papers.
Correct.
So it all starts with the protest against Vietnam, and they talk about leaks now. That was the big thing, and of course, the whole Watergate thing was, and Nixon called his special unit, what do you call them? They called them the plumbers.
Yes, that's right.
So it all started, it's the same thing with the leaks by Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. That started the whole ball rolling, and that was part of the anti-war movement. So there's a lot of there's
Kent
a lot of
State triggered a lot.
Right, there's a lot of similarities
Sure.
here with, and Nixon constantly, bitched, excuse
That's
my
okay.
language, about leaks, and that's all we hear about the Trump administration.
Well, that's what Jeff
talking about
Sessions wants to, Attorney
leak.
General Jeff Sessions wants to investigate the leaks.
And Nixon constantly attacked the press.
Yes.
And that's all Trump, lying, fake news, and
That's
of
right.
course, that's all Adolf Hitler did too. When in German it's Lügenpresse, lying press, and Hitler would say that in almost every rally. So Kent State can give us some clues what might happen in terms of, because the similarities in terms of who's protesting, what they're protesting, it's not necessarily a war, but it's the type of government that would engage a war that's unjustified and not authorized by Congress. And if we know anything about the man who occupies the dump that he claims it is, but I still say it's the White House, is that he wants to do things without anybody's approval. And he gets very angry and starts tweeting like a maniac when he's stymied by our system of checks and balances, congressional or judicial. So there's a lot of similarities.
And as you just said, he gets frustrated and starts a tweet war. I'm
Maybe
wondering.
we'll call him the Tweeter-in-Chief.
Tweeter-in-Chief, that's perfect. That's a good name. That's so Tweeter-in-Chief shares a lot of personality traits with Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Yes.
You know, both had very, very strong complexes in terms of being absolute rulers. I think of
Nixon said one time, I think it was in an interview with David Frost, it's not illegal if the president does it. And Trump feels the same way.
He feels the same way. And we've done, when you mentioned Hitler, because we have actually done a show, we did a series explaining the similarities between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler. And I'm sure across the bottom of your screen is running a reference to that show. You might want to check that out. We talked about that a long time ago. Now, I gave you the background on what happened at Kent State. I'll do it very quickly again. On April 30th, President Nixon announces the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. It's interesting and it's significant that the audience realized that in 1969 they were carrying on secret bombings in Cambodia, which were not effective. But that had been happening since 1969. The announcement came April 30th, 1970. On May 1st, there were protests at Kent State about the announcement of expansion of the war into Cambodia. And the university president, Robert White, sent out an order that protests would be banned on the college campus. Now, what that did was, of course, incite not only those that were against the war, but a lot of people who came out thinking this was an abrogation of civil liberties by stating that the protesters could not protest. And that just made the problem worse. And what we have is the mayor of Kent, Ohio, then calls out to the governor, who was a political law and order guy, who was also trying to run for he was running for the Senate in Ohio as a law and order candidate. So the mayor calls the governor has political ambitions, and this is on May 2nd, and the governor calls in the National Guard. On May 3rd, there is an arson that happens on the campus, and the ROTC building, which is the representative of the military on the college campus, is burned. The students cut the hoses, and the building actually burns to the ground. On May 4th, there are protesters, and the protesters are taunting the guards, but they're marching and they're peaceful. There was an FBI informant, this has just come out, an FBI informant by the name of Fred Nixon, who was on campus, and he was described as a photographer. And Nat Geo did a special on this, and there was a protester who noted that Fred Nixon is actually the person that fired the first shot with a handgun. That gun was taken from him by the police. There was a cover-up of the whole thing. And the next thing you know, after that shot, as the National Guardsmen are retreating and the protesters are very happy about them retreating, they turn I think 8 National Guardsmen first turn.
And somebody yells out fire.
Somebody yells out fire. They've yet to identify who that person was. And they fire upon children. These are college students who are protesting. The National Guard, first of all, why do they even have live ammunition? That's just unbelievable that they would fire on these young people. Alison Krauss was 300 feet. She was the closest protester to the guardsmen, and she was 300 feet away. Now, earlier today, I asked our associate producer, Walter, because I love football, and I just asked him for some names because let's talk. 300 feet is a football field. Is that not 100 yards? That's a football field.
Yes.
Okay. So they were saying that their rationale for firing on these children was that they were throwing rocks at the guardsmen. If Alison Krauss was the closest protester to them and she's 300
She should have
feet
been
away.
quarterback for the New England Patriots.
There you go. There you go. Because here's some stats that Walter gave me. They're rough, but they're round. They're approximate, but you'll understand what I'm talking about. Joe Namath had a very strong arm. He could throw a football 65 to 70 yards.
Right.
Terry Bradshaw had probably the strongest arm, and he was known to throw a football 80 yards. Randall Cunningham, because we're all Eagles fans here, Randall Cunningham, strong arm, 80 yards.
And that's a football, not a rock.
That's a football, not a rock. What kind of threat could Alison Krauss have posed to the National Guard with a rock? And if she was able to even come within 10 feet, she'd have been drafted. She'd have been drafted by the NFL. So Alison Krauss was shot in the back. Jeffrey Mueller, another protester, was shot in the mouth. William Schroeder was an observer. He was shot in the back. Sandra Scher was a student who was on her way to her next class. Wasn't even a protester. These are the 4 deaths that happened at Kent State. 9 other people were injured. What does that tell us about the mentality of the man sitting in the White House? Because the next day, what did he say? They should have shot the bums. What kind of language does that remind you of? Does that remind you of anyone, any current political figure? The same kind of language you would anticipate out of him. So
That's like him saying about Hillary Clinton, maybe the people, if she gets elected.
During a campaign stop, GOP presidential candidate Donald Trump told his supporters in Wilmington, North Carolina, to resolve their issues with guns. Trump believes if Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton wins the November elections, the only way to prevent her from appointing Supreme Court justices is to exercise their constitutional rights by bearing arms. Trump said, "If she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks." He then added, "Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is. I don't know."
Maybe the people have to take the Second Amendment.
that's right.
The
A Second Amendment solution.
Right.
Yes. We are faced with perilous times, and I like something that you said, Mark, when we were talking, when we were preparing for this show. Of course, you played Dostoevsky.
Yeah, I did. It's interesting because when I played Dostoevsky, one of the things I said is that Dostoevsky is Putin's favorite author. And Maureen Dowd in the New York Times article compared the Dostoevsky's character in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, to Trump.
Yes.
And she compared the tragedy that's going on now in our country to some of the episodes in Crime and Punishment. And she said Raskolnikov was reckless, he was a liar, he threw breadcrumbs to lead to, because he wanted to be caught. He was grandiose, he had a Napoleonic complex, many of the same things that she said about Trump. And they were both pursued by somebody that wanted to get
a dogged prosecutor.
Right, a zealot prosecutor. In Trump's case,
Mueller.
Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. and in Raskolnikov's case, Detective Petriot. And the interesting thing that in Crime and Punishment is that Sonia, who had a little bit of morality, finally convinces Raskolnikov to confess. But Maureen Dowd says Melania or Ivanka will never get Trump to own up. So it's very interesting, and we'll see how this tragedy plays out with the investigation. Because I truly believe that the Kent State incident was the turning point in the Vietnam War protest and finally led to the end of the war. And I think the investigation of Trump and the Russian connection by Special Prosecutor Mueller will be a catalyst in the same way that will either lead to Trump's impeachment or his resignation or some form of resolution of this problem that we're having with our leadership.
And that's why we wanted to do this show, because we always, here at Conversations Across Time, we pride ourselves on saying, we're not trying to tell you what to think, we're just trying to make sure you are thinking. And so we connect these dots, or we put these dots here for you to connect in any way you see fit. But you need to understand, it's very interesting that Raskolnikov would be someone that one can compare Trump to.
Yeah, and maybe I was thinking that Putin loved Dostoevsky, loves Crime and Punishment, and maybe he saw it before Maureen Dowd saw that Trump is the flawed character Raskolnikov, and he sees what he can do with him. So,
and he's playing him.
Yes.
And he's playing him. The thing also that's interesting about this is, you remember Nixon had a war with the press.
Yes.
Nixon had a war with the press. Same kind of thing that we see happening with Donald Trump.
And Nixon also had an enemies list.
Yes.
Trump had an enemies list. That was one of the disputes between Trump's advisors Bannon and McMaster, because McMaster wanted people that they had on the enemies list. And an enemies list for Trump is somebody that's not 100% loyal.
Yes.
You could be the most qualified person. That's why many of the important positions in the State Department and other departments are not filled, because they can't find 100% Trump loyalists. It might be somebody that voted Democratic once, or somebody that gave money to a Democratic candidate in the past, and they won't fill these positions because, as we know, the number one thing in Trump's mind is loyalty. Not loyalty to the country, not loyalty to the Constitution, but loyalty to the leader, which he considers himself. And to me, it's totally crazy. They don't even have, he's dealing with Korea and China, they don't even have somebody in the State Department at the Far East desk, a skilled diplomat at the Far East desk, because they can't find somebody that has the skills who also is 100% loyalist to Trump.
And where does that leave this country?
It leaves us
up
a creek without a paddle.
Yes, it does. And I'm thinking that the Kent State cover-up was very successful. It was very successful. I believe 8 guardsmen went on trial for that. All were acquitted. And the country was divided exactly as it is now. You had those people who considered themselves loyalists, that thought that whatever you heard from the White House and whatever direction that the military was taking was the right thing. And we have sort of the same thing going on now with the dichotomy. Those people who believe that there should be checks and balances in place are now, in fact, being accused of not being loyalists.
Right. And the other thing, as far as the acquittal, it's very difficult in this country because we have this macho image and people pounding to the citizenry head that law and order is the most important thing. So when police do something or shoot an innocent person, or the National Guard in the Kent State case, it's very hard to get convictions. I mean, we can go back to Rodney King, we can go back to more recently
the kid Ferguson,
right,
Michael Brown.
Right.
I mean,
so it's very difficult to get convictions. Juries don't want to do it. And the fact is that, as I think we said on the show, the prior show, law and order doesn't mean not protesting. Law and order means protesting in a non-peaceful way. If you protest in a peaceful way, you should be protected by the authorities, not be under threat of being killed or maimed by the authorities. If I engage in a peaceful protest and I go to the Ku Klux Klan,
Yes.
as long as it's peaceful, they should be
Exactly.
protected by the authorities, not be threatened by the authorities.
Sure.
And that's the problem. And when you start threatening people who protest, then democracy is going by the wayside.
And I think that's what we are witnessing now. And you think of, when you talk about how Donald Trump wants to be like Putin,
Yes.
one of the things that happens he's the richest man in the world, and the reason he's the richest man in the world is in order to do business in Russia, he gets a slice. He gets a slice of everything.
I find it amazing that his heroes are not like Jefferson or Lincoln. He mentions Lincoln. He said, "I'm the only person that's ever been more presidential than me than Lincoln." And I say nobody's been less presidential than you in the history of the country. But he admires Putin. He admires the dictator of the Philippines,
Yes.
who just shoots people because he thinks they're drug dealers.
Yes.
He admires the little fat boy in North Korea.
North Korea, yes.
Right. He admires Erdogan in Turkey.
Yes.
He has disdain for the Prime Minister of Australia. He has disdain for Angela Merkel in Germany.
Yes.
He disrespects the President of Mexico. So what does that tell you? If the President of a democratic country likes autocrats more than he likes Democrats, that's really scary.
It's a very scary proposition. And also, I think he's changed his position on the newly elected president of France because the man gave him a military parade. You talked about that before, because this is, last week you were talking about that, and just the idea that this man who never served in the military is fascinated with the military. But you know, I've been saying,
He thinks because he went to a military school, because he was incorrigible, that makes him an expert on the military.
and I have hope, and you know, I talk about in preparation for this show. Of course, everyone knows that we work very closely with our associate producer Walter, and Walter's, as are you, retired military. I mean, just someone who
Yeah, well, Walter served in Vietnam, was actually there. I wasn't in Vietnam.
Oh, no, I know, but I'm saying one of the things that comes up is that Walter sort of expressed that he doesn't think the military is crazy enough to actually let Trump lead to any military warfare with that,
I have a lot of respect for the military. When he issued the ban on transgender serving in the military,
they stood up.
ignored it. They just said, you know, it's a tweet, and if you don't give us a direct order and you don't explain to us why, we're not going to enforce it.
Yes.
I give the Joint Chiefs of Staff a lot of props for that. I really do, and I think that'll be the salvation, because I think he obviously, in my opinion, he has something to hide, or he wouldn't be so adamant about firing people and covering up the Russian.
They come close to investigating him.
Right.
Yes.
And when push comes to shove, he's going to try to do something that would ensure that he doesn't get thrown out of office or impeached, but stays in power. And that's going to be the test of the democracy. Will the military and will the courts and the Congress stand up and defend the institutions? And you were using the comparison to the war in Vietnam. Nixon was drinking heavily, he was losing his mind, and he wanted to nuke North Vietnam. And at the time, I think the Secretary of Defense was James Schlesinger. He ordered that nothing be done unless it came through him.
Yes.
So, and Kissinger was, who was the National Security Advisor at the time, said was also worried that Nixon would go off half-cocked and start something. So we got to hope these institutions stay stable and check this guy who has his hand on the button to start a nuclear war. But there are a lot of similarities, and Kent State could be, you know, our Kent State could be the thing that topples Trump.
It topples Trump. It topples Trump. I was thinking this is a very devilish thought, but I was thinking that, you know how the old-fashioned telephones had to be plugged into the wall? So I'm thinking that they probably cut the cord on the red phone in the Oval Office. I mean, someone of good sense has just said, we can't allow this.
Well, that's what we have to hope, that there's people,
Yes.
and they keep saying that.
Yes.
And some of the people who I thought had good sense kind of didn't stand up to him a couple times. And I want to see what happened, you know, now. And you know, if something happens, well, I mean, I was really happy that the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't enforce that order. And we're starting to see some Republicans in the Senate starting to stand up to him. I think Lindsey Graham said if he tries to fire Sessions or Mueller, it'll be hell to pay. So maybe the institutions are stronger than Raskolnikov Trump.
I can tell you something that is what I keep telling myself, that there are people in this country in position who are not going to let this Napoleonic, narcissistic, demented, overweight, popping fresh Pillsbury Doughboy take this country down. I have to believe that. Now I know that you know, I try not to be, but I try not to be that opinionated. But I have to say, this country has survived, and we are not going to allow the likes of a Donald Trump to do away with our institutions. The judiciary has been standing up to him. I mean, the Supreme Court right now, I don't know what the decisions will look like going forward, but I have to say that right-minded people are not going to allow Donald Trump and his ego to take this country down. It's just not going to happen. And I don't care how much money he has. I don't care that he's got his nose all the way up Vladimir Putin. He can tell you what Vladimir Putin had for dinner the night before. I just think that our country is so sacred and our institutions are so sacred that he can't do this. Now, how it's going to be accomplished, I don't know. I mean, it's. If
it doesn't happen, then we're in deep doo-doo.
Yes, yes.
If those institutions don't stand up, we're in very deep.
And I have to believe that the overriding principles and the founding fathers, while I don't think they ever envisioned that we would have such a clown residing in the White House.
They try to prevent it. If you read the Constitution, and even the emoluments clauses directed right at somebody like Trump, maybe by chance getting elected president.
Yes.
So they anticipated things like that. Just hope the institutions stay strong.
And that on that note, we are going to say thank you for tuning in. And this is Conversations Across Time, where we don't want to tell you how to think. We just want to make sure that you are thinking. This has been Mark Hoffman and Vivenne Crawford just talking about the tweeter-in-chief. Thank you very much. Good night.
Conversations across time, 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 Conversations across time. Conversations across